The USS Voyager is remembered as the ship that came home. 70,000 light-years from Federation space, cut off from resupply, isolated from oversight, it endured 7 years in the Delta Quadrant and returned with most of its crew intact. That survival is treated as heroism. The ship is celebrated for adaptability, for resilience, for refusing to abandon Starfleet ideals in the face of impossible odds. But survival at that distance and duration required more than resourcefulness. It required compromise. And compromise, when sustained across years without external review, does not preserve a system, it mutates it. Voyager did not return as the ship that left. It returned as something else entirely. The premise of institutional continuity assumes correction. Starfleet operates on the assumption that its vessels remain tethered to Federation law, that command authority derives from a chain that extends back to Earth, that moral limits are enforced by proximity to consequence. Voyager severed that tether on day one. The caretaker's array flung the ship into a region where no admiralty could countermand an order, where no tribunal could review a breach, where no treaty held weight because no treaty applied. What remained was a crew, a captain, and a hull. Everything else became negotiable. The question is not whether Voyager survived. The question is what it became in order to survive, and whether that transformation was ever acknowledged. Starfleet does not design its vessels to operate in isolation. The Intrepid class was built as a long-range reconnaissance platform, optimized for speed, scientific flexibility, and crew efficiency. It was intended to survey distant regions and return with data. The design assumes resupply. It assumes communication with Starfleet Command. It assumes that the ship will encounter known threats, operate under known treaties, and return to known infrastructure. The crew complement reflects this. 143 personnel, no families, no civilian population. A compact, efficient unit designed to operate independently for months, not years, and never outside the reach of Federation support. When Voyager was stranded, those assumptions collapsed. The ship had no shipyard, no deuterium reserves, no access to dilithium refinement facilities, no backup crew rotations, no diplomatic corps to negotiate passage, no admiralty to arbitrate disputes. The vessel became the entirety of Federation presence in the Delta Quadrant, and the captain became the sole authority empowered to redefine what Federation presence meant. Janeway did not inherit a government, she inherited the need to invent one. The first redefinition came within hours. Voyager absorbed the crew of the Maquis raider Valjean, not as prisoners, not as auxiliaries, as integrated personnel. The official framing treats this as pragmatic cooperation. 2 stranded crews, 1 mission, shared survival. But integration was not cooperation. It was annexation. The Maquis were enemies of the Federation. They had killed Starfleet officers. They had bombed civilians. They had rejected Federation authority as illegitimate. Janeway did not broker a treaty. She imposed a unilateral merger and reassigned former insurgents to key positions, including chief engineer, without review, without tribunal, without oversight. The justification was necessity. The ship needed crew. The Maquis needed a way home. But necessity does not erase context. The decision established a pattern. When faced with a problem that Federation doctrine could not solve, Voyager rewrote doctrine. No formal inquiry was ever convened aboard the ship to determine individual culpability for Maquis actions. No court-martial, no due process. The crimes were absorbed into operational silence, and the perpetrators were granted rank, authority, and access to ship systems. This was not mercy. It was expedience. And expedience, when normalized, becomes policy. Chakotay was made first officer. Torres became chief engineer. The chain of command was restructured not around competence or loyalty, but around the political necessity of preventing mutiny. Janeway could not afford dissent. She could not afford factionalism. So she purchased stability by distributing power to individuals whose legal status under Federation law was unresolved. The cost was institutional legitimacy. Starfleet's authority does not derive from the rank pips a captain chooses to distribute. It derives from a legal framework that extends across the Federation, backed by courts, treaties, and the capacity to remove officers who violate that framework. Voyager had none of that. What it had was a captain who decided that survival outweighed law, and a crew that accepted the decision because there was no alternative. The second redefinition came in resource acquisition. Federation vessels operate under strict protocols governing first contact, non-interference, and resource extraction. They do not take what they need. They negotiate, they trade, they withdraw if a culture cannot consent. Voyager could not afford that restraint. The ship needed deuterium, dilithium, food, medical supplies, and replacement components. It needed them continuously, and it needed them from cultures that had no relationship with the Federation, no reason to trust Starfleet, and no obligation to help. Janeway's solution was transactional diplomacy. Voyager offered technology, medical aid, and tactical assistance in exchange for supplies. On the surface, this resembles standard Starfleet practice. But the encounters were not balanced. Voyager held overwhelming technological superiority over most Delta Quadrant cultures. The ship possessed weapons, shields, sensors, and medical capabilities that local powers could not match. When Janeway offered aid, she was not offering partnership. She was offering the temporary loan of a strategic advantage in exchange for material support. The relationship was not diplomacy, it was extraction with a polite veneer. The Ocampa illustrate the pattern. Voyager encountered a species confined to an underground habitat, dependent on the caretaker for survival. The crew intervened, destroyed the array, and left the Ocampa to face the consequences. The official narrative frames this as protecting the Ocampa from exploitation. But the Ocampa were already trapped. The destruction of the array did not liberate them. It removed their only guaranteed resource supply and left them vulnerable to Kazon predation. Voyager did not stay to rebuild the system. It did not establish diplomatic relations. It did not offer long-term protection. It took what intelligence it could gather, made a moral judgment about a culture it barely understood, and moved on. This was not an isolated incident. Across 7 years, Voyager made first contact with dozens of species, many of whom had never encountered warp-capable life. The ship did not have the personnel to conduct proper anthropological surveys. It did not have the time to establish trust. It needed resources, and it took them from whoever was willing to trade. The power imbalance was never addressed. The long-term consequences were never tracked. Voyager moved through the Delta Quadrant like a storm, altering the trajectory of cultures it encountered and never looking back. The third redefinition came in the use of force. Starfleet vessels are authorized to defend themselves. They are not authorized to conduct offensive operations without direct orders from Starfleet Command. Voyager had no command structure to authorize offensive action. It had a captain who decided, mission by mission, when force was justified. And Janeway's threshold for justified force shifted over time. The Kazon Wars are instructive. Voyager was not at war with the Kazon. It was not defending Federation territory. It was not operating under treaty obligations. But the ship fought the Kazon repeatedly, destroyed Kazon vessels, killed Kazon personnel, and disrupted Kazon power structures. The justification was self-defense. The Kazon attacked first. They tried to steal Voyager's technology. They took hostages. Every engagement can be framed as reactive, but the cumulative pattern is not defensive. It is interventionist. Voyager could have avoided Kazon space. The ship had long-range sensors. It had astrometric data. It could have plotted a course around known Kazon territories, accepted the delay, and minimized conflict. Janeway chose not to. She chose the most direct route home, even when that route required fighting through hostile powers. The decision prioritized speed over caution. It accepted casualties, both Voyagers and the Kazons, as the cost of maintaining the shortest path to the Alpha Quadrant. The cumulative death toll across 7 years is not recorded in canon. We see individual engagements. We see ship-to-ship combat. We see boarding actions, sabotage, and retaliatory strikes. We do not see the strategic accounting. How many ships did Voyager destroy? How many personnel died in those encounters? How many of those deaths were unavoidable? And how many were the result of decisions Janeway made without oversight? The official story does not ask. It treats each conflict as episodic, each battle as isolated. But wars are not isolated, they are cumulative. and Voyager fought for 7 years. The fourth redefinition came in medical ethics. The Doctor was an emergency medical hologram designed to supplement sickbay operations during short-term crises. He was not designed to replace a chief medical officer. He was not designed to operate continuously. He was not designed to make independent ethical decisions. But Voyager's chief medical officer died in the first hours of the stranding. The Doctor became the ship's sole medical authority, and over time, he evolved from tool to person. Canon shows the Doctor questioning orders, refusing procedures, asserting rights, and demanding recognition as a sentient being. Janeway allowed this. She did not deactivate him. She did not restrict his autonomy. She granted him increasing authority over medical decisions, including decisions that contravened her own orders. The justification was pragmatic. The ship needed a doctor, and the EMH was the only option, but the consequences extended beyond medical care. The Doctor's sentience raises questions Starfleet has never resolved. Is he property? Is he crew? Can he be ordered to perform procedures against his judgment? Can he be deactivated as punishment? Can he resign? Voyager treated these questions as settled. The Doctor was crew, he had rights, he had autonomy. But that autonomy was never formalized. It was a courtesy extended by a captain operating outside Federation jurisdiction, revocable at any time. The ethical framework governing holograms in the Federation remained unresolved for years after Voyager's return. The Doctor's status was not clarified until legal battles forced the issue. But aboard Voyager, Janeway made the decision unilaterally. She declared him sentient, granted him operational freedom, and expected the Federation to accept that decision upon return. The presumption was extraordinary. A single captain, operating in isolation, redefined personhood for an entire class of artificial intelligence, and the Federation was expected to ratify that redefinition without debate. The decision was morally defensible. The Doctor exhibited creativity, self-awareness, and ethical reasoning. He deserved recognition, but recognition was not Janeway's authority to grant. It was a legal and philosophical question that required input from ethicists, legal scholars, and Federation courts. Voyager bypassed that process. It created precedent in a vacuum, and the precedent became fact because there was no institutional mechanism to challenge it. The fifth redefinition came in temporal policy. The Federation has strict prohibitions on temporal interference. The Temporal Prime Directive forbids altering past events, even to prevent catastrophic outcomes. Starfleet officers are expected to accept tragedy rather than risk cascading timeline corruption. Voyager violated this directive repeatedly. The ship encountered temporal anomalies, alternate timelines, and time-traveling entities more than once. In some cases, Janeway allowed events to unfold without interference. In others, she intervened. The decision was never consistent. It was situational, driven by immediate circumstance rather than coherent policy. The most egregious violation came in the series finale. Janeway from the future traveled back to alter Voyager's timeline, collapsing a Borg transwarp hub and shortening the journey home by decades. The act saved years of suffering. It also rewrote history, erased alternate timelines, and violated the foundational principle governing temporal ethics. The justification was personal. Admiral Janeway could not accept the losses her crew endured in the original timeline. She chose to rewrite those events, to spare her crew the pain she had witnessed. The decision was understandable. It was also authoritarian. One individual, operating outside legal review, decided that her judgment outweighed temporal law, and she executed that judgment without consulting her past self, her crew, or Starfleet command. The consequences are unknowable. We do not see the alternate timelines that were erased. We do not see the individuals whose existence was negated. We do not see the ripple effects of collapsing the Borg hub decades ahead of schedule. Canon presents the act as heroic, but heroism is not justification. The decision established a precedent. If temporal law can be violated to save a crew, it can be violated for any sufficiently compelling reason. The line between justified intervention and reckless tampering disappears, and Voyager crossed that line because no one was present to stop them. The pattern across these redefinitions is consistent. Voyager encountered a problem. Federation doctrine could not solve the problem. Janeway rewrote doctrine. The crew accepted the revision. The ship moved forward. Each redefinition was framed as temporary, a necessary adaptation to extraordinary circumstances. But adaptations do not revert. They accumulate. By the time Voyager reached the Alpha Quadrant, the ship was operating under a hybrid framework that blended Starfleet regulation, Maquis pragmatism, and unilateral command authority. The crew had internalized the pattern. When faced with impossible choices, they looked to Janeway. And Janeway decided what was permissible based on her judgment, her priorities, and her willingness to bear the consequences. The official story treats this as leadership. The hidden truth is that it was autocracy. Not malicious autocracy, not tyrannical, but autocracy nonetheless. Janeway held absolute power over a population of 143 individuals for 7 years, with no external check on her authority, no mechanism for appeal, and no accountability beyond her own conscience. She wielded that power with moral intent. She prioritized her crew's survival. She made decisions she believed were right. But moral intent does not eliminate autocracy. It justifies it. And justification is what makes autocracy durable. The crew did not rebel. They did not mutiny. They did not demand democratic governance or tribunal review. They accepted Janeway's authority because the alternative was chaos. The ship was surrounded by hostile powers, isolated from reinforcement, operating on failing systems held together by improvisation. Dissent was not a luxury Voyager could afford. Unity was survival. And unity required deference to the captain's judgment, even when that judgment violated the principles the crew had sworn to uphold. The psychological cost is never tallied. We see individual breakdowns. We see crew members struggling with guilt, isolation, and moral compromise. We see Torres grappling with rage. We see Tuvok's logic fraying under prolonged stress. We see Paris reverting to recklessness. We see the Doctor confronting his own expendability. But the systemic toll, the cumulative weight of 7 years operating under emergency conditions, is not addressed. Voyager's crew was not trained for prolonged isolation. They were not selected for psychological resilience under autocratic command. They were Starfleet officers, accustomed to rotation, shore leave, and the ability to transfer if conditions became untenable. Voyager offered none of that. The crew was locked in. They could not leave. They could not request reassignment. They could not appeal to a higher authority. They were bound to the ship, to the captain, and to each other, with no exit until the journey ended. The strain was inevitable. The miracle is that the crew held together at all. And that cohesion came at a price. The ship's alliances illustrate the broader compromise. Voyager formed temporary partnerships with species and factions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The Borg, the Hyrogen, the Vidians. Species 8472. Each alliance was transactional, bounded by immediate need, and dissolved the moment the crisis passed. But alliances are not neutral. They signal priorities. They establish precedent. And Voyager's alliances consistently prioritized survival over principle. The Borg alliance is the clearest example. Voyager encountered species 8472, a race from fluidic space capable of destroying Borg cubes with ease. The Borg were losing. They approached Janeway with a proposal: share technology to fight species 8472, and the Borg would grant Voyager safe passage through their space. Janeway agreed. She armed the Borg with nanoprobe technology capable of destroying 8472 bioships, turned the tide of the war, and secured passage for her crew. The decision is framed as pragmatic. Voyager was trapped in Borg space. The ship could not fight its way through. The Alliance offered a path forward. But the consequences extended far beyond Voyager's survival. The Borg used the nanoprobes to halt the 8472 incursion, regained territorial control, and resumed assimilating species across the Delta Quadrant. Voyager did not stop them. It enabled them. The official story does not dwell on this. Canon treats the Alliance as a regrettable necessity, but necessity does not erase accountability. Janeway armed the galaxy's most dangerous collective intelligence, knowing that the technology would be used to subjugate other species. and she made that choice because her crew's survival outweighed the collateral damage. The calculation was autocratic. One captain, operating without oversight, decided that preserving 143 lives justified empowering a force responsible for the assimilation of trillions. The decision may have been correct. The Delta Quadrant may have been better served by halting species 8472 than by allowing the Borg to collapse. But the decision was not Janeway's to make. It was a strategic choice with galactic consequences, executed by an individual with no mandate, no accountability, and no capacity to evaluate the long-term ramifications. And yet, the decision was made, because Voyager operated in a space where such decisions were unavoidable. The Hirogen Alliance followed a similar pattern. Voyager encountered the Hirogen, a nomadic species that hunted other sentient beings for sport. The Hirogen captured the crew, forced them into holographic simulations, and used them as prey. Voyager escaped, but rather than simply fleeing, Janeway negotiated. She offered the Hirogen holographic technology, allowing them to hunt simulated prey instead of living beings. The trade was presented as a humanitarian gesture. By giving the Hirogen an alternative, Janeway hoped to reduce their predation on other species. The consequences are ambiguous. Canon does not show whether the Hirogen adopted the technology or whether it reduced their hunting of living prey. We see the trade. We do not see the outcome. But the decision itself is revealing. Janeway armed a predatory culture with advanced technology, hoping it would alter their behavior without any mechanism to verify compliance or enforce ethical use. The decision was optimistic. It assumed the Hirogen would choose simulation over live prey. It assumed the technology would be used as intended. It assumed Voyager's brief intervention could redirect a culture's entire social structure. These assumptions were not grounded in evidence, they were grounded in hope. And hope is not policy. But policy requires oversight. Voyager had none, so hope became the operational framework. The pattern is unbroken. Voyager encountered morally complex situations, applied Starfleet ideals as far as possible, and compromised when ideals proved insufficient. Each compromise was justified. Each was framed as temporary. But compromises accumulate. And by the end of 7 years, the ship was operating under a moral framework that bore only superficial resemblance to Federation law. The question is not whether the compromises were necessary. The question is whether they were ever acknowledged. The clearest measure of Voyager's transformation is its treatment of the Maquis integration. By the end of the series, the distinction between Starfleet and Maquis crew had dissolved. Former insurgents wore Starfleet uniforms, held Starfleet rank, and operated under Starfleet protocols. The official narrative treats this as reconciliation. But reconciliation requires accountability. It requires acknowledgement of harm, restitution where possible, and a mutual agreement to move forward under shared principles. Voyager offered none of that. The Maquis were absorbed. Their crimes were ignored. Their grievances were left unaddressed. The merger was presented as pragmatic unity, but it was structural erasure. The Maquis did not join Starfleet. They were subsumed into it, and their distinct identity was eliminated in the process. This is not peace. It is suppression. And suppression, even when conducted with good intentions, does not resolve conflict. It defers it. The long-term cost became visible after Voyager's return. The Federation debriefed the crew, reviewed the ship's logs, and reinstated personnel. But no formal inquiry was conducted into the Maquis integration. No charges were filed. No trials were held. The decision Janeway made in the Delta Quadrant was ratified by silence. The Federation accepted that a Starfleet captain had unilaterally pardoned enemies of the state, and it chose not to challenge that precedent. The choice was politically expedient. Voyager's crew were heroes. They had endured 7 years in hostile space and returned against impossible odds. A public trial of Maquis personnel would have been divisive, painful, and politically damaging. So the Federation buried the issue. It allowed the compromises to stand. It treated Voyager's transformation as an acceptable cost of survival. But acceptable to whom? The families of Starfleet officers killed by the Maquis were not consulted. The colonies devastated by Maquis raids were not compensated. The legal framework governing insurrection and terrorism was not revised to account for Voyager's precedent. The Federation simply moved on, and the institutional contradictions were allowed to fester. Voyager's return did not resolve the compromises. It exported them. The technological legacy is equally troubling. Voyager returned with decades of scientific data, advanced technologies acquired through trade and salvage, and operational knowledge of species and phenomena the Federation had never encountered. This intelligence was invaluable. It reshaped Starfleet's understanding of the Delta Quadrant. It informed strategic planning. It justified the construction of new vessel classes optimized for long-range exploration. But the data was not clean. It was gathered under conditions that would have violated Federation research protocols. First contact procedures were bypassed. Non-interference directives were ignored. Species were studied without consent. Technologies were acquired through trade agreements that could not be verified or audited. Voyager's scientific achievements were built on a foundation of compromised ethics, and the Federation accepted those achievements without question. The pattern is institutional. When faced with a choice between enforcing ethical standards and accepting valuable intelligence, institutions choose intelligence. The precedent is older than Voyager. Section 31 operates on the same logic. The Obsidian Order, the Tal Shiar. Every intelligence apparatus justifies its existence by delivering results that legal methods cannot produce. Voyager was not an intelligence operation, but it functioned as one. It gathered data, formed alliances, and took actions that Federation law would have prohibited, and it delivered those results to Starfleet without accountability, and Starfleet rewarded it. Janeway was promoted to Admiral. The crew received commendations. Voyager was celebrated as a triumph of Starfleet ingenuity and resilience. The official story became legend. The compromises were erased. The costs were ignored. The transformation of the ship from Federation vessel to isolated autocracy was reframed as adaptation, and adaptation was celebrated as heroism. But heroism is not the same as righteousness, and celebration is not the same as accountability. The deeper question is what Voyager represents within the Federation's institutional structure. The ship was an anomaly. It operated under conditions no other Starfleet vessel has endured. But anomalies reveal stress points. They expose the limits of systems that function smoothly under normal conditions. Voyager's transformation was not unique because the crew was uniquely flawed. It was unique because the crew was uniquely isolated. And isolation is the Federation's blind spot. Starfleet vessels are designed to operate within a support network. They are backed by starbases, resupply depots, repair facilities, and communication relays. They operate under the oversight of Starfleet Command, subject to review by Admiralty boards, legal tribunals, and diplomatic corps. The system assumes connectivity. It assumes that vessels remain tethered to institutional oversight, that captains can be relieved if they exceed their authority, that crews can appeal to higher powers if command becomes abusive. Voyager had none of that. The ship was severed from the network on day one, and the institutional safeguards collapsed. What remained was raw command authority, unsupported by external review. Janeway became the final arbiter of law, policy, and ethics. Not because she sought that power, but because the system provided no alternative. The Federation's institutional design does not account for this scenario. It assumes that isolation is temporary, that stranded vessels will be recovered or destroyed, that no captain will be forced to operate independently for years. Voyager proved that assumption false, and the Federation has not revised its institutional safeguards in response. The lesson is uncomfortable. If a single Starfleet captain, operating with moral intent and the support of a loyal crew, can transform a vessel into an autocratic state within 7 years, then the Federation's commitment to its own principles is contingent. It depends on proximity. It depends on oversight. It depends on the ability to enforce accountability. Remove those conditions, and the principles degrade. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but gradually, compromise by compromise, until the ship that returns is not the ship that left. The final measure of Voyager's transformation is what it cost the crew. Canon shows individual struggles, but it does not tally the systemic toll. We do not see how many crew members suffered permanent psychological damage. We do not see how many relationships fractured under the strain. We do not see how many individuals compromised their values to survive, and how many of those compromises they carried with them after the journey ended. The official story does not ask. It treats survival as victory. But survival is not victory. It is continuation. And continuation at the cost of principle is not triumph. It is erosion. Voyager's crew returned. They were celebrated. They resumed their lives, but they were not the same people who left. They had spent 7 years in a system where the captain's word was law, where dissent was dangerous, where survival required constant compromise. They had internalized that system. They had adapted to it. And adaptation does not reverse simply because the external conditions change. The psychological cost of autocracy is not immediate rebellion. It is learned deference. It is the internalization of authority as inevitable. It is the quiet acceptance that some decisions are too large for democratic input, that some compromises are too necessary to question, that some leaders must be trusted because the alternative is chaos. Voyager's crew learned those lessons, and the Federation never deprogrammed them. The ship itself is preserved as a museum piece, a symbol of Starfleet's resilience and determination. Visitors tour the decks, view the modified systems, and hear the stories of the crew's ingenuity and courage. The narrative is triumphant. It celebrates the journey, the obstacles overcome, the impossible odds defeated. But the museum does not display the contradictions. It does not show the records of Maquis integration without trial. It does not show the logs of species 8,472 nanoprobe transfers. It does not show the casualty counts from 7 years of unreviewed combat. It does not show the temporal violations. It does not show the alliances with predatory species. It does not show the transformation of a Starfleet vessel into an autocratic state. It shows the hull. It shows the consoles. It shows the warp core. It shows the surface. And the surface is what the Federation wants to remember, because acknowledging the truth would require confronting the fragility of the system. It would require admitting that Starfleet's principles are not absolute, that they degrade under pressure, that isolation transforms institutions in ways that cannot be easily reversed. It would require asking whether Voyager's crew should have been debriefed not as heroes, but as individuals who had spent 7 years operating outside the legal and ethical framework they swore to uphold. The Federation did not ask that question. It chose celebration over scrutiny. It chose legend over accountability. And in doing so, it ratified every compromise Voyager made. The hidden mechanism is this. Institutions do not survive isolation intact. They mutate. They adapt. They redefine their principles to match their circumstances. And when those institutions return, they carry the mutations with them. Voyager came home, but it did not come home as a Federation starship. It came home as a vessel that had learned to operate outside Federation oversight, that had internalized autocratic command as necessary, that had compromised its founding principles in the name of survival. And the Federation accepted it, because the alternative was admitting that survival is not always worth the cost. Voyager is celebrated as the greatest ship in Star Trek because it returned. But return is not redemption. It is simply the end of the journey. And the journey transformed the ship into something the Federation could not acknowledge without confronting the limits of its own ideals. The official story is that Voyager proved Starfleet's principles can endure anywhere. The truth is that Voyager proved those principles are contingent. They endure when supported by infrastructure, oversight, and accountability. Remove those supports, and the principles become negotiable. And negotiation, over 7 years, becomes transformation. Voyager is not the greatest ship because it survived. It is the greatest ship because it reveals what survival costs when no one is watching. It is the measure of how far a vessel can drift from its founding ideals and still be welcomed home. It is the proof that the Federation values results more than process, that it celebrates return more than righteousness, that it prefers legend to truth, and the legend is what endures, because the truth is too uncomfortable to display in a museum.